So please welcome everyone in baxter.
Yes, so before I introduce, so the title of the talk today I'm doing is sonification as a means to generative music. So this is part of my, he's my PhD researchers in the Department of Music at the University of Sheffield. So what I'm going to do is tell you what generative music is, try and define it, how sonification is a means to it, and then give some practical examples of how I've explored this question in my research and other people who've approached it as well. So generative music perhaps isn't that well known a term, but it was coined by Brian Eno, the kind of sound artist, pop musician, producer, all-round Renaissance man, in the mid-90s to describe firstly a specific work he was creating called Generative Music 1, but he subsequently kind of expanded it out to describe a whole kind of body of work that he was creating, starting around 1975 with a record called Discrete Music, through Music for Airports, which people might know, and then various other works, right up to one which was released last year called Reflection. He describes these pieces kind of make themselves through a set of rules, and they're endless and endlessly changing pieces of music, constantly kind of generating. He's kind of closely aligned to algorithmic music, using systems of rules to create sounds, relationships between sounds. Although, crucially, generative music, and I think the reason why it's useful to use as a term separately, is that it captures the idea that the music unfolds in real time. So, unlike, say, Xenakis, who used kind of mathematical formulae to kind of define a load of string glissandi, once he kind of defined those, they produced a score and they're kind of playing the same way every time. Likewise, John Cage's chance procedures, even though he used indeterminate methods and kind of flip coins to define known values, in some of his pieces at least, the actual performance is fixed. He used it to create a score. Whereas generative works, the music and the process are evolving at the same time. People may recognise that formulation related to, say, Steve Reich's work, It's Gonna Rain, which Brian Eno's kind of saying is a bit of a touchstone. This idea of music as a process which is evolving in real time. But I think Eno is kind of massively expanded that idea and created this whole body of work based on that idea. Whereas Steve Reich maybe kind of did that one piece and then moved on. I've got a quote here. This is from I won't read the full thing out, and I'll just go with the salient points. This is from his most recent work, Reflection, where he included a kind of an online essay alongside, where he kind of very nicely actually kind of looking back through the previous works that kind of led him to kind of delineated his thoughts on generative music. And there's a couple of salient points from this kind of long paragraph that I wanted to pull out. Firstly, the idea that these are sort of like the process, if you like, of creating a generative work. First is the selection of sonic materials. He calls it a kind of constellation of musical relationships. It's kind of grand way of saying basically choosing what sounds I'm going to make. And I think important to Eno's practice and my own as well, actually, as we'll see when we get onto examples. The selection of musical materials is definitely within the gift of the composer in this case, not generating material of some sonification in the way that say Paul was really described as electric sonification this morning. Kind of very much kind of choosing sounds as a beginning point. Then there's a system of algorithms, or a system, which does something to these sounds. It arranges them in a certain way, it attributes them in certain kind of combinations. He describes this as a sort of an endlessly flowing, morphing stream or river of music. And he kind of alludes to that kind of old kind of saying, I think this from Greek philosophy, no one steps in the same river twice. You kind of have this constantly flowing, different stream of music, which is kind of constantly generating variety, phrasing. The fourth bit of that quote that I sort of wanted to, fourth bit of that quote to highlight is this idea of fine-tuning the materials and the rules. So again, kind of actively composing, not just necessarily accepting the results of the kind of system as it sort of throws them out, but kind of listening to it and thinking, well, actually, I'm going to kind of, maybe I'll change that rule slightly so it doesn't do that as often, that sort of thing. I think this is going to come to kind of prominence when I describe my own practice in a short while. This idea that, you know, we're still composing, we're not just running systems and accepting what a sonification, in my case, kind of churns out. Finally, he talks about it being like gardening as opposed to architecture. So if classical music is kind of like architecture, you know, all the details are specified in advance, there's a score and it's realised, and every bit is kind of, you know, predetermined. Whereas generative works are like a garden. You have plants and you know they are certain colours, certain heights, they're going to do certain things, some will self-seed, some are kind of like, you know, will be produced by kind of like division or whatever. And you kind of know what it's going to do. It's not completely indeterminate, but there's still an element of surprise when things you kind of set into motion do things you kind of perhaps haven't quite anticipated. At the heart of this is, you know, if you're making generative music, and I, you know, got interested in making these generative pieces, that's why I've kind of explored this PhD research. You have to have some kind of system, some kind of strategy for kind of creating the piece. You can't proceed in a way where you kind of specify every note. You know, if you're working in real time, you have to have a system which creates music in real time. Now, Eno's kind of, if you read some of his kind of descriptions of the works he's done, he kind of uses statistical rules. You know, he's got a system running, and you know, it makes this note every 20 seconds, and then there's a 1 in 20 chance that the octave of that instrument will jump up one, and there's a 1 in 100 chance that it will shift mode to, you know, from one to the other. You know, there's certainly rare events and quite frequent events. He's also used mechanical systems, you know, so his earlier works, kind of pre-computers, I suppose, or kind of the popularisation of computers in music. He just used tape loops which were at incommensurable intervals. So he'd have like a tape loop of a woman singing, you know, one that was like 7 seconds long, and one that was like 9.5 seconds long, and one that was 10.25 seconds long. So they constantly kind of reconfigured themselves in different ways, in a kind of unpredictable way. Not a completely unknowable way, but an unpredictable way. Contrasting with, say, if a tape loop is exactly twice the length of another one, you know, you get a kind of a more knowable kind of musical relationship. You know, you get 2 repetitions of this sound for every one of this sound. So they're kind of some systems he used, and when I got interested in kind of trying to create generative music, it occurred to me, you know, there could be something else which would give you this kind of random structure. And that something is, today, is sonification. So if we have an endless stream of music, an endless stream of data, live data being produced, we can create, if we link that to a musical parameter, we can create an endless stream of music. So, I mean, I think Falk did a good job of kind of talking about the kind of the definition of sonification this morning, and the kind of various debates around that. So, I haven't got time to go over it anyway. I can take an entire talk going over definitions of sonification. But for people who are familiar with the literature, this is kind of parameter sonification. This is so a change in one bit of this, I don't know, weather data, say that the temperature goes up by degrees Celsius, produces a change in a musical scheme that I designed. You know, a note plays, or you know, a drone kind of increases in pitch. And as he used that kind of classical allusion to no one steps in the same river twice, you know, if you've got a constant stream of data, no one sets foot in the same stream of data twice. You know, it kind of, by sonifying live data, it kind of automatically generates variety, and it's automatically unknowable what that data's going to do in the future for the composer. It's like kind of automatic generative music, really, if you design it right. Within certain parameters, but I'll get onto that as I give some examples. So, before I just show a few we hear a few examples from my own practice, I put there not such an original idea. I'm not kind of claiming to have invented this wonderful kind of original way of making music. You know, a few other people kind of took this idea. So I want to draw attention to one. John Luther Adams is the place where you go to listen, which is an installation. Just because it's a real kind of been a bit of a sort of touchstone for my own work and discovering it kind of like clarified a lot of my thoughts. I don't know if people know the work. It's a museum installation in the Museum of the North in Alaska. I guess John Luther Adams would feel sort of quite at home actually in the UK at the moment. Now his kind of practice is very rooted in place and very rooted in kind of, he makes these almost kind of these sort of romantic, descriptive works like landscape. He set about making this installation using geophysical data from the Alaskan region to create this kind of endlessly changing sound and light installation in the museum. Very briefly, you know, there's kind of earthquake seismic data which is kind of driving these bass-driven drum sounds in the bottom of the installation. There's auroral data, cosmic waves driving these high-pitched sounds, and then in the middle of the installation, data about the position of the sun in the sky. Obviously, being Alaskan, you've kind of got these huge big seasonal differences in the sunlight. You know, long periods of dark, and then the night sun as well. He kind of uses this to kind of produce this kind of expanding and contracting forms of noise. There's a few videos on YouTube if you want to check it out, and it's really interesting work. I'd love to go and see it, but you know, kind of fondling to fly to Fairbanks, Alaska isn't yet to be forthcoming. John Luther Adams, he wrote a book-length kind of treatise on creating this work, which is a really interesting insight into the kind of composer's method. The one thing I drew out of it is his great concern with kind of being true to the data and kind of creating this work that kind of makes sense of the data for people and feels like it's rooted in place. You know, he's kind of almost agonises about these kind of mappings that he's making. You know, he wants it to sound like the sun is rising. He wants the sound, you know, the auroral activity to sound and people to kind of feel it. And I think that's been a really important kind of thing to recognise for me anyway in creating works of sonification, is that yes, I'm using it to drive artistic processes, but I don't want people to say, well, you know, what's the point of using that data? What does it mean? You know, kind of, why have you sonified this? Why not sonify that? So, if I come on to some examples from my own portfolio, and hopefully that question of, you know, trying to fairly reflect the data will become apparent. I didn't want to do these as live videos, but it turns out my laptop can't hack screen capture and kind of like audio processing at the same time. So these are examples of kind of, and they're all kind of typically like this. My kind of modus operandi, which has been to use Python scripts to scrape data from the web or you know, various other sources, and pipe that into pure data patches, which are handling the audio processing. So Troy Ounce is a sonification of the international gold markets, and it uses. Well, let me play it and then I'll describe what it's actually doing. So what we have there is phase vocoder, which is doing this kind of pulse stretch type aesthetic. Stretching Spandau Ballet's 80s hit Gold. So there's a kind of an instant kind of musical kind of sonification of pun, I suppose. And if you imagine the sample is kind of is going through the phrasal encoder, and the pointer of the sample is moving very gradually as the gold price kind of goes up and down. This was influenced by Yannick Schaefer's work with multi-arm turntables, so where he had a turntable set up with 3 arms on it, so he could play a record at 3 points, 3 different points, and he could also arbitrarily kind of slow the record down. It's using ready-made material, but using the sonification scheme as a way of kind of finding your way through this material. And there's 4 copies of Spandau Ballet there, all starting in different locations and then being moved depending on the movement in gold price in dollars, pounds, Swiss francs, and euros. So this is this is one of my early works, I suppose, kind of trying to get around this idea of doing something interesting with data. This second work, Singing in the Wires, and again, kind of almost precisely the kind of same kind of modus operandi. This is based on the National Electricity Grid data. It turns out that they publish live data on the frequency of the grid, which we all think is 50 Hertz, but actually it can vary plus minus 1 depending on demand. So that got me thinking about Lamont Young's pieces, where he kind of based these drones on the frequencies you could hear in the electricity transformer outside his house, the sort of famous kind of Lamont Young myth. So this sets up a drone, a kind of a string drone, and the base frequency changes with this fluctuation of the grid, and the harmonic structure of it is based on these numbers here, which are the current demand in gigawatts. So here we have 364,069 gigawatts, which I've translated like a harmonic diagram into the 3rd, 6th, 4th, 6th, and 9th harmonics, and it sounds like. Changes every 5 minutes, so I'm kind of cross-faded two together to kind of show how it changes. And third work here, called Ephemeris de la Lune. So an ephemeris is a kind of data table which astronomers use to locate astral bodies. And this is taking information on the position of the moon, and if you imagine a stack of recordings of the Moonlight Sonata, it's playing those in the same way that the gold patch was kind of using this idea of it kind of being a record. The movement of the moon in the sky over 24 hours as the Earth spins is kind of playing these copies of the Moonlight Sonata very slow. So again, this kind of, if people know it, the kind of pull stretch kind of like, times 800% type mean you get on YouTube. So you can hear copies of the. So piano attachment copies and the position of the moon is playing the samples. The illumination of the moon determines how many individual versions you can hear at any one point. And the elevation of the moon determines how that. So you get this kind of constant kind of mix. I'm rapidly running out of time actually, so I'm going to skip over some. If I could just take an extra 30 seconds or so. This is a piece based on the international currency markets, and the works previous to this are very much kind of gone for drone and kind of its continuous data, so it kind of suggests continuous sound. Sort of like the national grid. It's this kind of this metaphor is kind of constantly humming kind of presence. Whereas the international currency markets are different. You know, the data it's kind of fast, it's rapid. It changes. So I wanted to kind of reflect that again, kind of trying to be kind of true to the data and kind of reflect it in the musical scheme I come up with. So this piece queries the changes in prices between currency pairs. This is how currency traders work, and depending on whether a currency is up or down, you get a blast of that particular country's national anthem. So if the dollar is up against the pound, you get a blast of the Stars and Stripes. And, if the pound is up against the dollar, you get a blast of the God Save the Queen. This is kind of influenced by Stockhausen's famous One Kingdom, which used their national anthems as its raw material, and it sounds. So the attacks of those sounds are being determined by the movement, the amount of movement in the two currencies, and the idea is this kind of like constantly kind of battling kind of sound as the currencies go up and down against each other. I'm out of time, so I won't go over any more. There were a couple more. Just want to round up with kind of 3-4 questions, just to summarise. So. One of the key kind of issues of this is how to present these infinite words. Kind of if you've got constantly flowing data, how do you present them? And I've kind of aimed towards kind of installation type presentations, similar to outside actually with the board data plan. There's this key question of does it make sense? Just because I thought that it'd be fun to link gold data to Spandau Ballet, does that make sense to everyone else? That even though the song kind of hear it in the sonification, do you need some kind of external materials telling you what's going on? All the time, am I being true to the data, or am I kind of bowdlerising it for my own purposes? And finally, and I think this was again hinted at by Falk in his introduction, these hardcore scientific sonifiers would kind of like faint at some of the sonifications I've done, and they would insist that this isn't true sonification. This is data-driven art. You couldn't listen to my currency sonification and say, oh yes, yes, the dollar must have just gone up against the pound by 2 cents. There's a tension in the literature, isn't there, between kind of scientific sonification and using it for artistic purposes. And I'm avowedly, I think, the portfolio works that I've just put forward kind of showing that I'm on the kind of artistic side. Anyway, sorry for slightly overrunning, and any questions?
Yes, any questions? Well, what I'm quite interested in, doing the same kind of thing for sonification and stuff like that, is that how do you choose your source data? Is it because it's easily available? Is it because you want to make a statement? Or how do you decide that you use one data set over another, one topic over another for your, is there certain things in the data that you look out for?
I think there's a bit of a chicken and egg kind of question. Some of these works, like the national, I can't remember how I came across it, but I came across the fact that the National Grid published the data, and so it sets off a whole kind of, I don't know, you think, oh, what can I do with that? Oh yeah, so there's sometimes you come across it by chance, whereas the currency one, for example, that was kind of, I need to find some data that's kind of different to what I've done before. So there's kind of both things going on. It's kind of like, it's kind of what data sometimes either it triggers a kind of an artistic response, or it doesn't. And I guess I've got examples of half-made things which have never kind of beyond the design stage, because you kind of think, oh, this data's banal. It doesn't change enough to do kind of anything interesting. Although you could turn that into an aesthetic kind of choice as well. This is I don't know, this is a really, you know, the pitch drop experiment in viscosity, you know, kind of with this piece of tar bitumen, and it's kind of, it drips once every 90 years or something kind of ridiculous. And there's a live camera on it, you know, that you can watch, and nothing happens. You could kind of wax John Cage and say, I'm going to turn this into a piece where kind of, you know, it's silent and nothing happens. But if you just happen to be there at the right moment, it kind of makes this huge sound and then goes away again. So yeah, there's an element of, you know, I can do something interesting with this. An element of kind of exploration, and an element of kind of, I don't know, kind of getting into data that you never kind of knew existed, and kind of trying to become an expert on kind of seaboy data or currency trading, for example.
Any more questions?
Yeah, I was just wondering about the does it make sense question. Did you say, like, how important is that to you? Because I know when Falk talked about it and had that, you know, his solution was to have the visuals and then it turned into the sound in the piece itself. And I'm just wondering how, in terms of something like gold, is the conceptual idea that it's doing that enough for you, or do you want to get across something about those shifts in the piece?
I mean, I suppose the gold piece, it's a bit tongue in cheek, and yeah, the conceptual accomplishment. What's the right word? Kind of gratifies me as an artist, you know, I'm sort of happy with it. But it kind of relates to that last point. There is a tension of, well, yeah, but, you know, you could choose anything to kind of commute this time stretch, you know. It could be any data changing. So, yeah, it's important personally that I feel like I've kind of explored the best possible work that I can make out of the data. But it does trouble me that people may not hear what I hear in it. And a lot of conversations I've had with my supervisor, who's from a kind of acousmatic, electroacoustic tradition, Adrian Moore, Sheffield, if you know, you kind of, I suppose their tradition should be that everything should be contained within the artwork, and you should just be able to enjoy this as sound as itself. So I have tried to make works which, you know, can actually listen to as pieces, without lots of external materials. But it's kind of tricky. If people say, well, you know, I can't hear what that's doing. Has it failed as a sonification? Has it failed as a kind of, you know, if you can't, I suppose what I'm trying to do is express that something is changing. So, you know, you can hear this generative process as it happens. But that does require, I think, either introductory talks to the work, you know, posters on the wall, kind of, you know, describing how they're working, visual data as well. I mean, I think that John Luther Adams' work, you know, it's interesting that he's mixed it with this this light installation as well, you know, and I think if memory serves from the photos of the installation, you know, it does have like, you know, art gallery style plaques saying, you know, what you're hearing is X, Y, and Z, you know, and that just kind of, you know, inform people.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we can leave the rest of the discussion for the break, then we can have a bit more in depth about like the specific positional issues. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.